Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. The US pledges to prevent ISIS from re-establishing itself in Syria. Meanwhile, Anthony Blinken continues talks in the Middle East, visiting Jordan and Turkey in his final days as Secretary of State. Originally mistaken for missing US journalist Austin Tice, this American prisoner talks exclusively to Al Arabiya. And FBI Director Chris Wray says he will step down from the role in January at the end of Biden's administration. To our top story, and the United States is expressing cautious optimism for the future of Syria, free from former President Bashar Al-Assad. But while many Syrians are celebrating, the Pentagon is trying to carve out a strategy that prevents a resurgence of ISIS in the country. Nick Harper reports from Washington.
The celebrations for the fall of a government and a return to life after 13 years of brutal civil war. For others, the end of Bashar al-Assad's government means a return home. Thousands of exiles have poured into the country over the past few days.
The war is over and we're returning to the country, to our homeland, where we'll live with ease. It's what we need. It's in God's hands now.
The US is determined that the current safety remains. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says Washington wants to ensure the Islamic State doesn't regain a foothold in Syria. In a phone call with his Israeli counterpart, Israel Katz, Austin promised no safe haven for the group. The Pentagon says US prisons in the country holding ISIS detainees remain under the control of the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces. But the SDF has reported attacks on those facilities. In the past few days, the US and Israel have carried out hundreds of airstrikes on parts of Syria, including on ISIS targets, with Israeli troops conducting military operations along its border with Syria. Hundreds of political prisoners have been freed since the fall of the Syrian government. Some families are still searching for their loved ones, but it's raising hope in the US that journalist Austin Tice could now be found. His parents have campaigned for more than a decade to bring him home after he was abducted in 2012 while reporting in Damascus. US President Joe Biden has said he believes Tice is alive, but his exact location is still unclear.
Finding Austin Tice is a top priority of this administration. The FBI and State Department have offered up to $11 million in reward to anyone who can provide information. We do not know where he is located. We do not know.
The years of darkness of the Assad regime have now passed, but the days ahead are still uncertain. The US is making it clear there are potential dangers in that uncertainty, with all the unknowns of what comes next, how the country is governed. The Biden administration says it supports a peaceful, inclusive political transition, but it knows that comes with the need of maintaining strong counter-terrorism connections. Nick Harper, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
An American man imprisoned in Syria who was reportedly first identified as the missing US journalist Austin Tice has spoken exclusively to Al Arabiya today. The man, who says his name is Travis, allegedly crossed into Syria from Lebanon and was imprisoned for 7 months. Here's what he had to say.
They thought that you're Austin Tice first. Did you know about the case of Austin Tice before you were imprisoned?
No.
No. Because he's been imprisoned for 12 years. You've never heard of that?
No.
And what's your work? What did you do? Why did you enter Syria?
I came on a religious pilgrimage.
Uh-huh.
I'm a Christian.
And how did they treat you in the prison?
Well, it was okay. I was fed, I was watered. The one difficulty was that I couldn't go to the bathroom when I wanted to. And so I had to wait on that. I was only let out 3 times a day to go to the bathroom. Other than that, I was not beaten, and the guards treated me decently.
Mm-hmm. Did you hear any kinds of any kind of torture voices in the prison?
Yes.
Let's speak to the journalist responsible for that video, Al Arabiya's own correspondent, Taher Baraka, who joins us. He is live in Damascus. Taher, you have been at Sidnaya prison speaking to the American prisoner. Who was he and what did he tell you?
Thank you for having me. So what happened actually that he was in the house after he was released. The place that we went to was the house that he was took into when some villagers in that area, in the suburbs of Damascus, which is Al-Dibyaniya, saw him walking on the street. So they took him into this house where I went to after like lots of calls and lots of trials. We've been able to reach that house. I think all the press in Syria was crying. Even journalists, colleagues from Syria and abroad to reach him. But finally, we could be the first Arabic channel to reach there and the first channel at all to reach that house and talk to him. Actually, you know, all the villagers were there. They were trying to protect him. They were trying to talk to him. They fed him. They gave him some tea and water so that he can be able to talk. And when I arrived, I told him, I myself was believed that he might be Austin Tice. I know Austin Tice and the pictures and the photos that I've seen for him for 12 years covering this issue from the headquarters. But I thought maybe the prison, maybe I was under the, under the sudden we went there. We were overwhelmed by the story. So I told him, they said, you're Austin Tice. He said, no, I'm not Austin Tice. I told him, do you know about Austin Tice's case? Have you ever heard of it? He said, no, I know nothing about Austin Tice. I was imprisoned for 7 months in the Far'a Palestine, which is very famous in the negative way, indeed, in Syria and in the Arab world for the torture that takes place there for the prisoners from their guards. I asked him about his guards and how did they treat him in the prison. He said they treated me well, but they used to let me go to the bathroom for 3 times only during the day. And they used to bring me some water and some bread and maybe some kinds of vegetables only, maybe cabbage, he said. So just to keep him alive, I believe. But he wasn't tortured, as he told me, but he was for 3 continuous months. The last 3 months, it was in the dark. He was not allowed to go out of his cell. The first 4 months, he was allowed to go in the sun. But the last 3 months, he was not allowed to go. I asked him about his family. He talked to them. He said, no, they didn't even know that I'm coming to Syria. When I crossed the borders from Lebanon, I was intending to visit some Christian sites for pilgrimage. So he's very religious, as he seems, and he told me that I want to go to Jordan. I asked him, are you going to the States now? He said, no, I want to go to Jordan to visit the Christian sites as well. So he looked safe. He looked okay. And they told me that they brought a doctor to him, and he said he's okay, no other problems. And then some of the official government came to that house and took him out. I don't know much about his whereabouts right now until we hear a word from the American officials about where he's going to be in the coming days.
Al Arabiya correspondent Taher Baraka, thank you so much for joining us. US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has arrived in the Middle East for his final tour of the Biden administration. Blinken will be focusing on the Gaza ceasefire and hostage deal, as well as a transition in Syria following the fall of Assad's government. He will have talks in Turkey tomorrow after being in Jordan today. The State Department have said the tour is intended to reiterate the United States' support for an inclusive Syrian-led transition to an accountable and representative government. We can now speak to Sinan Ulgen, former Turkish diplomat and now the director of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies in Istanbul. Sinan, thank you so much for joining us. So Blinken is on his 11th trip to the region. He's expected to meet Turkish officials tomorrow. What will likely be on the agenda?
Well, a couple of core issues. The first one that you mentioned, namely how can Turkey and the United States cooperate to ensure that Syria heads towards a future of political stability. Secondly, on the Turkish side, one of the big issues will be to essentially negotiate with the United States about the future role of the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF. And thirdly, Turkey will also ask the US to support an international effort to concentrate international funding for the economic reconstruction of Syria. So those are essentially the three main themes that, the foreign ministers will discuss.
The Turkish intelligence chief is reportedly in Damascus, and there are reports of a 4-day ceasefire being implemented between Turkish-backed forces and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. Could these 4 days be used for a more comprehensive agreement to end the fighting long term?
Well, obviously they could, but, the agreement, the comprehensive agreement, will not be concluded in 4 days. The complexities are very substantive, and so far the expectations have also not been convergent. So this would be a first step indeed, but the handicap to some extent is the fact that this is an outgoing US administration. So there's really a limit to how much commitment the U.S. can take and how credible that commitment would be, given that in around a month, Turkey will need to deal with a different U.S. administration whose position on Syria may certainly be different.
Turkey retains a presence in Syria, and Israel is trying to gain a foothold in the country. Are they competing for influence and territory?
No, geographically, we're speaking about, very different regions of Syria, so they're certainly not competing in geographical terms. However, there may indeed be a degree of competition in terms of future influence over the administrative setup in Damascus. Namely, which country will have more influence over the transitional government. Obviously, as things stand, Turkey has a clear advantage, given that it has supported one of the core components of that being the Syrian National Army, but also has, contacts with the Hyer Taher al-Sham. And in that sense, there is obviously more weight that Ankara brings to the table. And this is obviously very visible with now the diplomatic traffic that is witnessed in Ankara with Tony Blinken, but also von der Leyen from the EU will also be in Ankara in about 2 days.
Looking at all the dynamics on the ground in Syria, which shares a long land border with Turkey, what is Ankara's desired outcome?
Well, Ankara's desired outcome is a Syrian state that remains unitary in nature, that has consolidated its territorial integrity, and that can provide security and economic prosperity to its citizens and control its borders. That's what Ankara wants. Now, whether this is achievable under current circumstances, that's essentially going to be up to Syria's own political stakeholders. But Turkey will seemingly make every effort so that this transition succeeds politically and economically, so that Syria becomes a valuable and prosperous neighbor to Turkey. That's what's in Turkey's interest.
Sinan Ulgen, former Turkish diplomat and now the director of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
The director of the FBI, Chris Wray, has said he will resign at the end of the Biden administration in January. Wray, who has been in the role since 2017 and still has 3 years remaining of his 10-year term, was likely to be forced out by President-elect Trump, who has nominated former federal prosecutor Kash Patel for the job. But it's left many at the FBI feeling concerned about Wray's replacement and whether that person will be able to separate themselves from politics.
How's the feedback so far?
Let's get the reaction from Washington now with our correspondent, Benji. Hyer. Benji, thank you so much for joining us. Was this inevitable, considering Trump's pick for FBI director has already been announced?
Yeah, it's not a surprise because Christopher Wray, perhaps unsurprisingly, doesn't want to become the third FBI chief to be fired by a president, and that is what probably would have happened had he remained in post into Donald Trump's administration. The president-elect making no secret about his feelings towards the current FBI makeup, the Justice Department, which he sees as being weaponized, and his intent to replace independents like Christopher Wray with more loyal appointees. For example, Kash Patel, who you mentioned, the former Justice Department lawyer. He has in recent weeks mirrored Donald Trump's aspiration for retribution against his political adversaries, individuals that Donald Trump calls, quote, the enemies within. Patel also saying he wants to empty the FBI HQ and deal with what he refers to as the deep state. Incidentally, Christopher Wray was one of Donald Trump's own appointees. He was put into the position to head the bureau after then-President Donald Trump fired James Comey. That inspired that investigation, you might remember, into whether Trump won the 2016 election due to the assistance of Russian interference. Christopher Wray has spoken wistfully about his time at the FBI, but he oversaw a very tumultuous period. Investigations into Donald Trump, 2 of them, that obviously contributed towards the way that the president-elect feels about the Justice Department, and of those assassination attempts, 2 of them, into the president-elect as well during this most recent election campaign. Wray saying that there is no time for complacency or distraction, a message that he wants to see continued, taken on, I should say, by his successor and staff at the agency. But Donald Trump has reacted gleefully to the news of Christopher Wray's resignation, the most high profile ahead of Trump's inauguration, the president-elect saying that this is a, quote, great day for America.
So we've heard from Trump, but how has the Capitol responded to Wray's resignation, Benji?
Well, I think that there was a realization, a kind of resignation from those within the Biden administration that this would ultimately happen. There was some hope within Biden circles that Christopher Wray would stay on, almost as an act of defiance, only then ultimately to be fired by Donald Trump, as opposed to resigning early and giving in to what many Trump critics see as, an authoritarian force. But, whether it happened now or down the line, it was unlikely due to the way that Donald Trump feels about Christopher Wray and his investigations into him, both that one related to the alleged efforts to overturn the previous election, the mishandling of classified documents as well, both, cases that will now be likely consigned to the dustbin of history given Donald Trump has won the election. Because of those actions, Donald Trump has been massively disparaging about Christopher Wray. And so his time, was limited, even though there is still many years to go until the end of his term. I think there is now concern amongst the Biden administration and many within the FBI about what comes next for the agency under Kash Patel if he is approved, that is, by Congress. And that is not necessarily a guarantee, given his controversial plans for the agency that I mentioned before about how he effectively wants to completely revamp the way that it works, send out thousands of employees from the Bureau to the streets as well, and of course seek revenge against Donald Trump's political opponents, even if they haven't committed a crime.
And finally, just in 60 seconds, tell me, Donald Trump has been named Time Magazine's Person of the Year for a second time. That's after surviving 2 assassination attempts. What has the reaction been like in Washington to this news?
Well, he said that he's honoured, which is an interesting one because often those on the front page of Time magazine are not put there as an endorsement. There have been many figures from history that the Time magazine doesn't want to endorse, but still puts on the front page. Donald Trump now featuring for a second time. I think if you look at precedent, what often happens is if someone wins a US election, they tend to find themselves on the front cover. So had Harris won, she would have likely been the figure. Instead, Donald Trump, of course. He says he's honoured and he's tried to use the day to promote himself in New York. I mean, in terms of the reaction here, I'm not sure the Biden administration is paying that much attention, frankly, to Donald Trump, but they may pay attention to the comments that he made in the Time magazine interview where he reiterated his willingness to pardon those that partook in the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, that insurrection attempt to try to overturn the 2020 election that Trump lost to Joe Biden.
Benji, Hyer in Washington, thank you. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the news today. South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol has defended his shock decision to declare martial law last week. In a surprise TV address today, he said the attempt was a legal decision to protect the country's democracy. Yoon has also suggested that he would not step down ahead of a second vote to impeach him in Parliament on Saturday. The US has warned that Russia may use its new intermediate-range ballistic missile against Ukraine again. According to the Pentagon, an intelligence assessment suggests an attack could be carried out in the coming days. It comes as both sides battle for military advantage ahead of negotiations to end the 3-year war. Children as young as 10 will face adult jail time in the Australian state of Queensland if convicted of crimes such as murder, serious assault and break-ins. The government says the new laws will reduce youth crime and act as a deterrent, but experts argue evidence suggests otherwise. The United Nations has also criticised the reforms. Bird flu antibodies have been discovered in horse blood samples in Mongolia. It's feared all horses could be at risk in areas where bird flu is prevalent and could pass the virus onto humans. The threat of the H5N1 virus could become the likely cause of a future pandemic. Mark Zuckerberg's firm Meta has donated $1 million to Donald Trump's inauguration fund. That's as the Facebook founder tries to mend ties with the president-elect. In August, Trump threatened to imprison the billionaire if he did anything illegal to influence the presidential election. Staying with Trump, and the US president-elect has invited Chinese President Xi Jinping to attend his inauguration next month. This could be a signal that Trump wants to court his Chinese counterpart just as he threatens fresh tariffs. But it was not clear if it had been accepted. It comes as the Kremlin reveals it has not received an invitation for the Russian President Vladimir Putin to attend the ceremony on the 20th of January. Laura Westbrook reports.
Well, Donald Trump invited Chinese President Xi Jinping in early November, shortly after winning the US presidential election, according to reports. And he said in an interview last week that he had been in communication with Xi Jinping recently, but he declined to say what they had discussed. No Chinese leader has ever attended a US presidential inauguration. Indeed, no foreign leaders have attended one in more than a century. However, it is common for foreign dignitaries and diplomats to attend, and this is also a practice that Beijing has adopted. And this comes as the US and China brace for a renewed standoff after Trump campaigned on a promise to implement 60% tariffs for all goods imported from China. And last month, he vowed to impose an additional 10% tariff on Chinese goods unless Beijing does more to stop the flow of illegal drugs, particularly fentanyl. And Trump has also tapped a number of China hawks to lead the economic and security portfolios in his incoming administration. And according to reports, the president-elect does put a lot on leader-to-leader relationships to help him make deals and to advance his agenda. And so this invitation could be seen as an olive branch from Trump. However, analysts here say it would be very unlikely that Xi Jinping accepts, with very little upside for him. And separately on Wednesday, in written remarks to the US-China Business Council, Xi Jinping said that Beijing is prepared to stay in communication with the US. And he also called for market openness from both countries. And that very much is aimed at those Trump tariffs.
Our correspondent there, Laura Westbrook in Hong Kong. Thank you for joining us. Let's take a look at some of the top business news now. And many small firms in Britain say they have stopped selling goods to Northern Ireland and Europe because of new EU customs rules brought on by leaving the European Union. Many businesses said they were unable to meet the new paperwork requirements. A recent YouGov poll shows the majority of so-called Brexit voters would now accept a return to free movement in exchange for access to the single market. The Australian government has said it will create new rules to force big tech companies to pay local publishers for their news content. The decision came from a previous law passed by Australia back in 2021 and affects big tech giants like Meta and Google. Turning to sport now. The New York Mets has signed Juan Soto, considered to be one of the season's best hitters from rival team, the New York Yankees. Soto is reported to have signed a 15-year contract worth $765 million. And Max Verstappen has thanked Formula E for donating $250,000 to charity after the driver lost out on his fourth successive F1 title. The Formula E boss made the wager in February after he argued the F1 was too predictable in comparison to his series. The cash will be split between Red Bull's Wings for Life Foundation, a new fund to provide greater opportunities for women in sport. A reminder of our top stories. The US pledges to prevent ISIS from re-establishing itself in Syria. Meanwhile, Anthony Blinken continues talks in the Middle East, visiting Jordan and Turkey in his final days as Secretary of State. Originally mistaken for missing US journalist Austin Tice, this American prisoner talks exclusively to Arabiya. And FBI Director Chris Wray says he will step down from the role in January at the end of Biden's administration. And that's all from us on W News. Thanks for joining us. Hadley Gamble is coming up next, and don't miss Tom Burgess-Watson with GNT. Good night.